manuscript of the Journal of Joy, Nico Steinhardt describes this text as a direct effect of his religious conversion from Judaism to Christianity and of his secret baptism in the prison of Gilab. He writes, again to the Securitate, "It is an intimate journal written by me at my home between 1970 and 1971 for my own clarification, as a means of revealing to myself systematically an entire inner process. I felt the pressing need to clarify to myself the reasons of the deep religious transformation I went through. Such a clarification imposed itself on me as an inner spiritual necessity." All right, but does one need 500 pages for this? Steinhardt explains that although, quote, initially conceived as a confession of religious conversion, as a strictly religious account of the conversion, that initial core expanded into an account of the afterglow of that ineffable experience in prison. Hundreds and thousands of bits of life, observations about prison life, as well as the wider nebula of associated insights, memories, hopes, aspirations, illumined by refracting and echoing the light and joy by which the experience of Christ had been manifested to him. So let us follow Steinhardt's own explanation about the journal, and here find our beginning. "Two of the detainees," he writes, "accomplices, pass in front of the peephole to block it. Hastily, but with that priestly skill where haste does not hamper the diction, Father Mina utters the necessary words, marks me with the sign of the cross, pours all the content of the kettle on my head and shoulders, and baptizes me in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. I am born again out of wormy water and a swift spirit. If I survive prison," and this was not a given, he was convinced he would die. He was a frail man in his 60s, and they had already beaten him as a welcome to the prison occasion so severely that he was convinced he was going to die. "But if I survive prison, I am to present myself for chrismation to a priest whose name Father Mina gives me." And then he writes, "Whoever was christened as a child has no way of knowing and cannot imagine what baptism means. Above me dawn ever more frequent assaults of joy. One might say that each time the besiegers climb higher and hit with greater relish and precision. So it's true. It's true that baptism is a holy mystery, and that holy mysteries do exist. Otherwise, this happiness that surrounds me, fills me, clothes me, overcomes me, wouldn't be so unimaginably wonderful and whole. Peace, and a sweetness in my mouth, in my veins, in my muscles, and a sense of absolute certainty, a mescaline-like merging into everything, and a perfect departure into clarity. Revelation is proven true. Behold, I make all things new. And Paul also, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold, all things have been made new. New, but ineffable. I cannot find words, except for trivial, stale ones." A little over a year later, Steinhardt documents a similarly overwhelming experience. "I call it a dream," he writes at one point, "because I dare not call it something else." In recounting it, however, he does speak about a vision. "The light surrounds me on all sides. It's total joy, and it does away with everything. I'm bathed in blinding light. I float in light. I am in light, and I exult. I am, the light says to me. I am, and I understand, through my intellect and by the means of feeling, I understand that it is the Lord, and that I am within the light of Tabor, that I don't merely see it, but also dwell in its midst. Over and above everything, I'm happy, happy, happy. The joy not only lasts a long time, but also grows, constantly increases. If evil has no bottom, then goodness has no ceiling. The circle of light grows ever wider, and the joy, after it has enveloped me silkily, suddenly changes its tactics, becomes firm, throws itself, collapses upon me like avalanches that anti-gravitationally lift me up. And then again it proceeds otherwise. Tenderly it cradles me, and in the end, bluntly, it replaces me. I no longer am. No, I am, but so strong that I no longer recognize myself. The ecstatic state associated with baptism erupts again in his mention of fellow inmates, who, paradoxically, he says, remain kind and joyous, as only folks in prison can be, a foreshadowing of monastic hesychia and heavenly bliss. Or in his narration of the grace-filled forgiveness and reconciliation with a former member of the anti-Semitic Iron Guard. So this is a Jew, right? Sandu tells me he is sincerely sorry that he had been a legionnaire, member of the Legion of the Archangel Michael, and he asked for my forgiveness. Perhaps, he says, it is unbearable for me to stay with him and so close together. I respond that I don't see why he mentions forgiveness to me, because if that's what we're talking about, I also should ask for his forgiveness, because I'm a Jew and he has to stay glued to me. Waves of joy wash over us, flow, flood us, overwhelm us. I asked Sandu, and if I copy St. Seraphim of Sarov in the forest scene with Motovilov, I do so unintentionally, whether he sees on my lips the smile that I spy on his, that of hesychasm, having its origin in the uncreated energies. Evidently, this is not the hieratic language of Byzantine lives of saints, whose carefully curated vocabulary does not include terms such as mescaline, avalanches, or anti-gravitational ascents. Nevertheless, the theology here is deeply traditional. The state of ecstatic suspension between being himself and other than himself evokes Galatians 2:20, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." The light that illuminates from within, no less than from without, identified as the Lord Jesus Christ, but speaking the words of the divine appearance to Moses at the burning bush, recalls passages from the Macaran homilies or from St. Simeon the New Theologian. The bold statement, "I understand that it is the Lord and that I am within the light of Tabor," is to be read not only within its immediate context, but also as part of a cluster of references to monastic hesychia, hesychasm, uncreated energies, and the famous dialogue on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit between St. Seraphim and Motovilov. It is also noteworthy that Steinhardt finds it important to assure his readers that he had treated the alleged vision with skepticism, the skepticism required by the ascetical tradition, that he had shared it with a saintly hieromonk, Father Haralambie Vasilakia, whose relics he then went to venerate when they were secretly moved from the prison where he had died to the monastery of Chernika. In short, the experience itself fits squarely within the venerable tradition of Orthodox spirituality, stretching beyond St. Simeon and St. Gregory Palamas, to the 20th century figures of Archimandrite Sophroni and Elder Emilianos of Simonopetra. Moreover, Steinhardt had, with the invaluable help of the historian of culture Virgil Cândea and his vast library, become increasingly familiar with the ascetical and mystical literature of both Eastern and Western Christianity. He had available, at the very least, Father Dumitru Staniloai's 1938 monograph and translation of Palamite text, monograph from Gregory Palamas and text in translations, and the first 4 volumes of the Romanian Philokalia. Cândea recalls his friend's voracious appetite for reading just about anything, but also the increasingly disciplined and methodical study of theological and spiritual literature. This apprenticeship had started years before the trial of the intellectuals, where Steinhardt was convicted of imaginary crimes but jailed, and resumed with greater intensity after his release from prison. So I think it's safe to assume that the bookish knowledge Steinhardt had accumulated offered him the vocabulary with which to give an account of his overwhelming and ineffable experience of Christ. Although the prisoner's faith, Steinhardt and his fellow inmates, supported by the divine grace, did indeed convert prison into a laboratory of holiness, just as, in the words of Byzantine hymnographers, the zeal of the 3 youths and the presence of the mystical angel Christ transformed the fiery furnace into a heavenly church. Still, Steinhardt does not mince words in depicting the horrific reality of his imprisonment. He says, "Cell 34 is a kind of long and dark tunnel. It has many of the powerful elements of a nightmare. It's a cave, it's a canal, it's a subterranean intestine, cold and deeply hostile. It's a barren mine, it's an extinct volcano's crater, a pretty successful image of a washed-out hell. Soot covers everything in a thick, greasy layer of slimy blackness, continuously expanding, adhesive. We are shaking with cold, we feel overwhelmed by dirt, and we are hungry. So, the all too human setting of the theophany is prison. Prison and cell and so forth refers primarily to this terrible experience that he had just exited as he started to think of and then later write this journal. Harassment, intimidation, interrogations, unjust accusations, condemnation, incarceration, torture and torture and torture. It was within these cells, he writes, designed only to lead people to denunciation and filth, to collapse and madness. In this almost fancifully unreal and sinister place that he was to know what he calls the happiest days of his life. As an alumnus of the prisons of Jihlava, Gerla and Aiud, Steinhardt harbored, however, no illusions about the society into which he and others were released in 1964. Romania had in fact become a larger prison, itself contained within the vast Soviet concentration universe. This is the setting. If during the dictatorships of the Iron Guard and then Marshal Antonescu, that is between 1940 and 44, Steinhardt had lost his house, been disbarred, he had been disbarred and forced to do menial work, shoveling snow and so forth. In the new regime, the new communist regime, the Steinhardts lost all property, and Nico Steinhardt was pushed into unskilled labor. Moreover, between 1966 and his death in March of 1989, he was the object of continuous surveillance by the Securitate under code names such as the Orthodox and the Writer. And there were 3 periods of especially intense actions by the secret service. At first, after his release from prison, the authorities were worried that his relentless work of keeping in touch with former inmates and other suspicious types might create a web of mystically inclined reactionaries and agitators. The Securitate deployed its specific means in order to isolate and compromise. And these were the words that show up again and again from 66 to 89, to isolate and compromise the Orthodox or the Writer as a religiously obsessed fanatic. When one of the informants, a fellow inmate who had made the pact with the devil, informed the Securitate that his friend had shown him the completed manuscript of a text called Journal of Joy, and that upon reading it, he, the informant, had found that this text was denigrating the ideology and achievements of the regime, the secret police panicked. This little old man had been doing all of this in secret and had apparently 500 pages that might go abroad, that might be disseminated, that might do a lot of damage. On the basis of a forged anonymous denunciation to the police, there was a neighbor, a good citizen, an upright citizen, complaining about Steinhardt that he was a dangerous person, a pervert, who was visited by young boys and who was hiding Western currency, pornographic images, and guns. The Securitate searched his house, grabbed the manuscript, and started interrogating Steinhardt. Several days in a row, between December 14th and the end of the month, he was required to write declaration after declaration after declaration, to search his memory, to explain again and again when, how, and why he had written this text, who had typed it up for him, how many carbon copies of it existed, whether anything had been smuggled to the West. Surveillance came to an end after the comrades eventually became convinced that all was under control. There was only one copy of the journal, which they had confiscated. The man was stubborn in his obscurantist, mysticist convictions, but they had neutralized his influence, and they were working on him, as they said, through several informants recruited from among the closest friends and relatives. Meanwhile, Steinhardt was sharing with informants, knowing that the information would go up to the secret police, his plan to write to Comrade Secretary General of the party himself, to Ceausescu himself, and to ask for his manuscript on the basis of the Constitution of the Socialist Republic of Romania, which made provision for artistic and religious freedom. Eventually, the petition was sent to the Writers' Union, and he made appeals to anyone who would listen to him. And all of this drama in order to hide the fact that a second copy did exist. And that he had hidden it with a fellow inmate, Alexandru Paleologu, who was also reporting to the secret police. But they were arranging what he should report to the secret police. The third period lasts for a full 12 years, from 1977 until Steinhardt's death. The little septuagenarian, plagued by serious illnesses of the heart, the digestive system, and the spine, becomes a real problem. He publishes essays, book reviews, translations, and yes, books, all the while complaining about any pages or chapters that were removed by the censors. He insists on entering monasticism. He is rejected. He tries again. He is rejected again. Tries again, ceaselessly. The regime offers him immigration to Israel. He rejects it. He asked to visit relatives in Belgium. They let him go. And this is how he experiences a few months at the monastery of Szeptoni. But, to their despair, he wants to return. He says he loves his country and he wants to continue his work to serve the fatherland. They would rather that he stayed there, but he returns. He tries again to find a monastery to join, and eventually, at the suggestion of Constantin Noica, the main member of that lot of the intellectuals, the one they wanted to get at first and foremost, at the suggestion of Noica, he settles in the little skete of Rohia, where he is received. And those who met the monk in literary circles in the 1980s, because his habit had given him the blessing to continue his work as a literary critic, sensed something Christ-like, utterly other, and utterly endearing about him. As one of them writes, Steinhardt was among us like a saint, like Saint Nicholas, kind, generous, wise, prodigal with himself, protective of those who need to be protected. Around 1983, 1984, the Securitate realized that Steinhardt had been conducting very effective hostile activities under their very noses, namely sending books to his friends at Radio Free Europe. This Radio Free Europe that is now being defunded, unfortunately. This was where he was sending books through a network of friends, through the monastery, through all kinds of means, but he was the single largest exporter of Romanian books, which all made their way there, were then discussed, and became also the pretext of discussing Romanian realities, to the despair of the Securitate. A whole new team and a different branch of the Securitate were added to the efforts of surveillance, isolation, and discreditation. And the expulsion from the monastery was taken into consideration by the secret services. They wanted to pressure the abbot and so forth to have him expelled. It might have been imposed and probably carried out eventually, but Steinhardt died in March of 1989, and communism was toppled a few months later in December. Steinhardt's articulation of the Christian faith is shaped by both his mystical encounter with Christ and by the experience of social and political oppression. The violent clash between mystical experience and the context of social and political oppression left an unmistakable ethical trace, crystallized into a number of memorable, clearly articulated ethical mandates that validate genuine spirituality and offer us much needed orientation today. Which is why, a little commercial, you should buy this book in translation. As he comes to state when he's a monk already, in a short text called Orthodox Creed, composed in the mid to late 1980s, the Taboric light and joy necessarily engender an ethos of joy, benevolence, courage, moral intelligence, and civility in the circumstances of everyday life. As one can easily gather from the very title of his journal, Steinhardt counts joy as an important marker of genuine spirituality. He writes, in order to distinguish the Christian from the caricature or imitation, there is no procedure more certain than investigating whether the aspirant is cheerful and content. If the person is intolerant or sullen or agitated or sad or upset, he is not a Christian, no matter how faithful to virtue. The Christian is free, hence happy. Aside from joy, writing again as a monk some 15 years after the Journal of Joy, then Father Nicolae insists on a Christian ethical formula that excludes any self-righteous, morose, pseudo-religious zealotry. And this is a text called Monastic Reflections for monks especially. Fundamentalist fanaticism of any kind is repugnant and feels daft to me. The monk zealously employing fanaticism is only masquerading as a Christian, and is an orthodox estranged from the faith he supposedly professes and witnesses to. Our faith has always been known for its steadfastness, but also for its distaste towards anything not grounded in Christian kindness and in our forefathers' discernment. Courage, another theme, is very important. And in talking about courage as a central Christian virtue, Steinhardt's account pays homage to his elderly father, Oskar Steinhardt, who shines as an unconventional icon of courage. Following the initial invitation to sign a declaration incriminating his friends in the so-called Lot of the Intellectuals in December 1959, they had just very politely told him that there was a declaration already written. He didn't need to bother to write it himself. All he needed was to sign it. And these fascist bastards would be put behind bars for the good of the country and so forth. Well, when he was given this choice, Steinhardt had asked for a few days of reflection and had returned home, because the comrades had told him that it would be a pity were he not to sign and then get into trouble, and his elderly father would then be left alone, old and sick, and certainly to die by himself like a dog, they said. When he got home, his father met him with a stern rebuke. "Why'd you come home, you fool? You gave them the impression that you're hesitating, that there's a possibility you might betray your friends? In business, when you say, 'Let me think,' it means you've already accepted. But you must under no circumstances accept to be a witness for the prosecution. Come on, stop dawdling. You must go to prison. I'm heartbroken, but there is no other way." And on the night before the arrest, it is again the elder Steinhardt that shines. "My heart is heavy." Dad, however, in his pajamas, tiny, chubby, and joyous, is full of smiles and dispenses last pieces of advice, like a coach before the bout. "They told you to not let me die like a dog. Well, if that's how it is, I tell you what, I'm just not going to die. I'll wait for you. And you, now listen to me, don't you embarrass me. Don't be a scared Jew. Don't shit your pants." He kisses me emphatically, leads me to the door, stands up straight as for a salute, and he salutes me in a military way. "Go," he says. The journal insists also repeatedly on courage. Christianity isn't sheepish. It is, in fact, he writes, a religion of courage. Steinhardt observes the following scriptural detail. Among those meant for the lake of fire in Revelation, who comes first? It's not the sexually immoral, it's not the violent, it's not the whatever fill in the blanks, it is the cowardly. During one of the brutal initial interviews, Steinhardt understands that the Lord's call is for him to resist his interrogators, while also breaking his own more or less subtle inner resistance to Christ. And he writes, "Surrealism is good in Paris. Delirium may be good in Zurich at the café. But here is not there. Here it is a life and death affair. Here is the pool of Bethesda. Either you throw yourself in or you don't. Here, now, now, now. Here you declare yourself, boy. Here, right here, you choose." But courage is not to be proven only in extreme situations, like in that entering prison. Steinhardt's recipe for daily life calls for the following. Ask, demand, knock, dare, don't be afraid, don't be frightened, persevere, charge, be awake, be of sound mind. So many exhortations abundantly showing that it doesn't behoove us to be stupid. And with this we discover another facet of Christianity according to Steinhardt, which is what he calls intelligence. Steinhardt quotes with delight from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who had written in an exegetical piece that given that Christ, the bridegroom, is wisdom, the bride of the word, the bride of wisdom, ought not to be stupid. And he loves that. It does not become the church to be stupid. And he states emphatically that Christians should not confuse faith with stupidity. He writes, "Nowhere and never did Christ ask us to be stupid. He calls us to be good, tender, honest, humble-hearted, but not idiots. The Lord loves purity, not imbecility. For one who is blessed with the gift of understanding, stupidity, at least from a certain point onward, is a sin. The sin of weakness and of laziness and of not using your talent." What Steinhardt has in mind here is a sort of willful and therefore culpable intellectual and moral self-amputation. This intelligence or clear-sightedness also includes a certain sobriety and lucidity. Ignorance, he writes, idiotization, passing blindly through life and through things, or passing indifferently, are from the devil. But this also allows the Christian not to be taken in by the seeming benign or even positive disguises of evil. What can be objectionable, for instance, when the notable and of course regime-friendly university professor delivers magnificent lectures on 19th century Romanian poetry, or when theology journals publish robust studies detailing the Catholic crimes and abuses in 18th century Transylvania? What about the communist authorities passing Decree 770, penalizing abortion? Shouldn't one bracket out the political issues and simply recognize what is correct, accurate, and morally good? Steinhardt writes, "I cannot agree with the priests, even though the very devout and admirable Sofian is among them, recently canonized, who glorify the edicts of the police in regard to haircuts, girls' skirts, and so forth, who make haste with ardent words of praise to approve the moral measures taken by the totalitarian government, the abolition of prostitution, the prohibition of abortion, and the complication of divorce." Why? How could he write this? Because, he says, they conveniently bracket out what is most important. He writes, the spirit in which such measures are grounded. Because they put the emphasis on some trifles, forgetting that these orders come from the same servants of the one who lets the terror and the lie fall upon all of us. Christians should always remember that the Spirit cannot blow except where there is freedom, where virtue issues from free choice. Ideally, for him, quote, "If the terrible problem of temptation were to not come up, we might imagine a city in whose central square, in front of the cathedral, we see a brothel, a tavern, a casino lined up. Only they'd be empty." And he says, "And I like to imagine the devil leaning on the shutters, lighting up the darkness of the empty building and the green gaming tables with a bitter smile of offended despair." Christians, for him, must always remember that the true truth is the truth that is relevant, which is usually the truth that a dictatorship will not allow. Steinhardt puts the matter clearly. When people are being sawn in two, right next to you, announcing that 2 and 2 is 4 means that you must scream at the top of your lungs, "It is an injustice crying out to heaven that people should be sawn into two." And therefore, giving lectures at the university, that Goethe wrote poetry and truth, that Voltaire died in 1778, and that Balzac, ladies and gentlemen, is a romantic realist, while the professor's former colleagues are being tortured in the Gulag, or publishing respectable studies about the historical ills of Uniatism in Transylvania at the time when Byzantine Catholics found themselves stripped of their legal status and all their bishops imprisoned, or to engage in a sound doctrinal critique of Jehovah's Witnesses at the time that they are being jailed and persecuted, or to applaud the penalization of abortion through State Decree 770, while overlooking the dehumanizing treatment of especially working-class women forced to submit to monthly examinations by gynecologists appointed to the factories so as to check the required pregnancy. All of this he finds without, and he says, without the slightest hint of malice or disrespect, but also without the customary beating around the bush, frivolous, ridiculous, and lacking in basic Christian and human decency. Steinhardt is also keen on deflating any dreamy talk of heroic striving forward on the path of holiness, ascending from glory to glory, emphasizing instead the blessing of modest, even ridiculously modest gains. He recognizes, for instance, that the call to courageous the call to be courageous, to speak truth to power, the relevant truth, the forbidden truth, at any risk, may often be too much to ask in a repressive totalitarian regime, where the vast majority of people are enslaved, dependent, broken, battered down by blackmail and compromises, where simply surviving counts as a victory. And he writes, no one is required to be a hero or a martyr, but everyone can be required to offer no more than is asked of them. The imposed ration is enough. There's no need to push away with a grand gesture the spoon you were handed and then yank on the dipper, the ladle, the larger serving spoon so as to gobble, chew and munch greedily on the foul-smelling matter. Surtout pas de zèle. Above all, no zeal. The French is in the original. It is this well-known zeal in one's own enslavement that perverts the conscience, that calls black white and white black, and launches the race to an ever greater enthusiasm for one's own enslavement and annihilation. And secondly, he recommends a stubborn allegiance to doing good deeds. Maybe his Jewish background, I don't know. The good deeds all the time, as much as possible, in spite of anything, even if that good be tinged by pride or hypocrisy. He says, the saints are the limit. Next in line come the heroes and the knights. And behold, trailing behind, come limping along, somewhat ridiculous, huffing and puffing, the daring stalwarts of the good, who are not to be disregarded either. Impostors of the good. In other words, even if our thoughts are teeming with the most abject impulses and our inner pride shames us, let us nonetheless strive to do good. Unworthy as we are, impure, half in bad faith, half in good, hypocritical, conflicted, still not cringing, gladly servile, resigned slaves of evil. For many Romanians who discovered his writings soon after the 1989 revolution, Father Nicolae Steinhardt embodied and expressed the gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that made orthodoxy credible, in spite of the many flaws of the Church as an institution. Steinhardt remains a spiritual mentor for anyone seeking to relearn the faith and to share its joy and beauty with the world. His Journal of Joy has, as I've tried to show, as its generative core the experience of baptism into Christ's luminous joy or joyful light, theophany. But that theophanic event occurs in particular concrete circumstances which filter, as it were, and shape the experience. As it passes through this prism, the ineffable light is refracted into ethical mandates, which colors, as it were, of the ethical spectrum are more prevalent, which less is a function of the distinctiveness of each person, as well as of the specific social, political, economic, ideological circumstances. In a time when too many Orthodox Christians seem to have learned their faith at the feet of the Grand Inquisitor, and catechized in this fashion have considerable difficulty with basic tenets of the faith, like do not lie, do not steal, do not kill, do not take the Lord's name in vain by claiming to kill in defense of the faith, Father Nicolae's embodiment and articulation of the gospel remains as it was when the journal was written, humbly subversive. In reading Steinhardt, one learns that if Christian mysticism, for lack of a better word, is to be genuine, it must always be certified by a corresponding ethical trace. We are called as Christians to live not by lies, whether lies we accept, lies we tell others, lies we tell ourselves, to remember that our faith demands and empowers us to be courageous, to cultivate kindness, patience, and a sense of humor, to deepen our commitment to Christ, and at the same time to practice an intelligent, civil, and generous assessment of the world around us. It is with all of this in mind that I declare myself deeply grateful and overjoyed that Nicolae Steinhardt's Journal of Joy is now able to speak to a new generation and in a new language, bearing witness to the truth that even in the midst of bitterness and darkness, it is worth binding ourselves to Christ and allowing Him to give us the joy of being for now impostors of the good and to save us despite ourselves. Thank you for your patience.